In 1847, a photograph was taken at a prosperous plantation in rural South Carolina. The image showed Lady Margaret Thornhill sitting elegantly in a mahogany chair, surrounded by her 3 young sons and 6 remarkably young enslaved men. The composition was unusual for the time. Ladies rarely posed alongside enslaved people, and when they did, it was with women who cared for children, never with men. The photograph remained in a family trunk for over 170 years, until in 2019, a great-great-granddaughter discovered the daguerreotype along with documents that changed everything. When historians cross-referenced the image with census records from the era, something disturbing emerged. All the men in the photograph were between 16 and 22 years old in 1847. Even more intriguing, subsequent censuses from 1850, 1860, and 1870 showed an impossible-to-ignore pattern. Dozens of children born at Thornhill Plantation, all with ages suggesting paternity during the same periods. But official marriage records for the enslaved people were completely empty. Mothers were listed, fathers remained systematically absent from documents. What began as a photographic curiosity transformed into a devastating investigation into one of American slavery's darkest secrets: deliberate forced breeding programs orchestrated by plantation ladies. Lady Margaret wasn't simply posing with workers. She was displaying her reproductive investment, young enslaved men selected specifically to ensure the property generated new generations without purchase costs. Court archives revealed letters exchanged between Margaret and other ladies in the region, discussing methods of natural property increase and selection of healthy breeders. Wills discovered in attics explicitly mentioned future offspring as part of calculated inheritances. And when archaeologists excavated the plantation cemetery in 2022, they found remains of over 80 children who died before age 5, an infant mortality rate 3 times higher than neighboring plantations, suggesting deliberately negligent conditions to control population. The story of Margaret Thornhill and her photograph isn't just about one woman and one plantation. It's about an industrial system of reproductive control that transformed human beings into livestock, where white ladies administered breeding programs with the same coldness they managed cotton harvests. And it's about the silence that lasted 170 years, until a simple photograph forced the truth to emerge. Chapter 1. The photograph that should never have existed. 178 years ago, at an isolated plantation in rural South Carolina, a photograph was taken that should not exist. In 1847, daguerreotypes were rare, expensive, and reserved for special occasions: weddings, family portraits, property records. But the image taken that summer day at Thornhill Plantation was none of these things. It was something different, something that for nearly 2 centuries remained hidden in a leather trunk in a Charleston mansion's attic, waiting to reveal a secret so disturbing it ended up buried in silence. Before we continue, subscribe and turn on notifications. Here we unearth secrets buried by official history and give voice to what was silenced. The discovery happened in March 2019, when Claire Hartwell, a 67-year-old retired history teacher, inherited her great-aunt's estate. Claire didn't expect to find much beyond antique furniture and some family documents, but when she opened a locked trunk in the attic, she came across something that would forever change her understanding of her own lineage. Among yellowed silk dresses and perfumed letters was a velvet box containing a perfectly preserved daguerreotype. The image showed a woman of approximately 35 years, seated in an ornate mahogany chair. Her dress was dark taffeta with puffed sleeves and a cameo brooch at her neck. Her face was severe, pale eyes fixed on the camera with an expression Claire would later describe as proprietary. Around her, 3 small blonde boys, her sons, dressed in formal velvet suits, and standing behind them, 6 young black men, shirtless, wearing torn raw cotton pants. Claire recognized the woman immediately. It was Lady Margaret Thornhill, her great-great-great-grandmother, a figure revered in family history as a brilliant businesswoman who kept the plantation running after her husband's premature death in 1845. But the photograph's composition deeply disturbed Claire. Why would Margaret pose this way? Why with enslaved men and not with the women who traditionally cared for children? Why were they all so young? At the bottom of the box, Claire found a small paper label, yellowed with time, written in faded ink: Thornhill Property Breeding Program, 1847. The words froze her blood. She didn't fully comprehend the meaning at that moment, but something instinctive told her this photograph wasn't a simple family portrait. It was a record an inventory, a proud declaration of ownership over something far more sinister than land or cotton. Claire took the photograph to a historian specializing in American slavery, Dr. Marcus Webb, a professor at the University of Charleston. When Marcus saw the image, his face went pale. In 40 years studying southern plantations, he had never seen anything like it. A white lady deliberately posing with young enslaved men, her small children beside her, as if presenting a commercial operation. The absence of women in the photo was especially revealing. In the rare plantation photographs that included enslaved people, they were always older women, wet nurses, caretakers, never young men. Marcus decided to investigate. He started with South Carolina Census records, searching for Thornhill Plantation in the years following 1847. What he found was a pattern so clear, so meticulous, so deliberate, that it left no room for doubt. In 1850, the census listed 43 enslaved people on the Thornhill property. In 1860, that number had jumped to 89. In 1870, after abolition, freedmen records showed 127 people who had been Margaret Thornhill's property. But the growth wasn't through purchase. Regional slave transaction records showed no significant acquisitions by Margaret between 1847 and 1865. The increase was almost entirely through birth. And when Marcus began tracking ages, a devastating picture emerged. Between 1848 and 1865, 84 children were born at Thornhill Plantation, an average of nearly 5 births per year, an extraordinarily high number for a property that size. Even more disturbing, records listed mothers, but paternity fields were systematically empty. Father unknown, father not registered, no paternal information. These phrases repeated document after document. In a society where lineage records were meticulously maintained for legal ownership, this absence wasn't accidental. It was deliberate. It was systematic erasure. Marcus digitally enlarged the photograph, studying the 6 men's faces. Their expressions were empty, distant, as if looking through the camera rather than at it. There was no smile, no pride, no recognized humanity. They were there as objects, as tools, as breeding animals being presented by their owner. When Marcus showed his findings to Claire, she wept. The woman her family had celebrated for generations, the strong matriarch, the resilient widow, the shrewd businesswoman, was none of these things. She was an architect of an industrial forced breeding program, transforming human beings into reproductive commodities. And that photograph wasn't a family portrait. It was a catalog, a demonstration of ownership, a proud record of an exploitation system she had perfected. The investigation was only beginning. Census records were just the first layer. There were letters, wills, diaries, and most terrifying of all, a cemetery no one had excavated. The truth about Thornhill Plantation and Lady Margaret had been buried for 178 years. But the photograph she took so proudly in 1847 would end up becoming the evidence that would condemn her forever. Chapter 2. The Men Without Names. The 1847 photograph showed 6 men, but official records treated them as numbers, not people. For weeks, Dr. Marcus Webb and Claire Hartwell scoured archives searching for any information that could give identity to those faces frozen in the daguerreotype. What they found was a deliberate system of erasure. Names changed, lineages destroyed, histories reduced to lines in ledgers. The 1850 census records listed Thornhill Plantation's enslaved people only by age, sex, and color. There were no names. Federal law didn't require enslaved individuals to be identified individually in censuses. They were counted as property, not as citizens. But Margaret Thornhill kept her own internal records, and it was in these private documents, discovered in a court archive in 2020, that the truth began to emerge. Margaret's ledgers were meticulous. Each enslaved person had an entry with name, estimated age, market value, and crucially, a category: field, domestic, or breeding. Marcus felt nauseated reading that last word written with the same naturalness one would describe cattle. Of the 43 enslaved people listed in 1850, 12 were marked with the breeding category, 6 men and 6 women, all between 16 and 24 years old. Cross-referencing birth dates in the ledgers with the apparent ages of the men in the 1847 photograph, Marcus managed to identify 5 of them with reasonable certainty. Their names, recorded only in Margaret's private documents, were Samuel, 19 years old, Jacob, 21, Moses, 18, Daniel, 20, and Thomas, 22. The sixth remained impossible to identify precisely. 3 men in the records had compatible ages, but knowing their names was just the beginning. Marcus needed to understand where they came from and why they were chosen. Purchase records revealed something shocking. 4 of the 6 men hadn't been bought at public auctions. They were acquired through private transactions with specific plantations in interior Virginia and Georgia, places known for breeding operations, plantations that specialized in producing young, healthy enslaved people for sale. Samuel, for example, was purchased in 1845 from a Virginia property for $950, an extraordinarily high price for a 17-year-old with no specialized skills. The sales receipt, preserved in archives, included a handwritten note, healthy specimen, robust constitution, family history of numerous offspring. The language was identical to that used to describe breeding stallions. Jacob had an even more devastating history. He was separated from his mother at 14 and sold specifically because he demonstrated precocious physical maturity. Records indicated he was kept at an intermediate property for 3 years, where he was prepared before being sold to Margaret. What prepared meant was left to imagination, but documents from other plantations of the era revealed that young enslaved men were often forced to produce children at breeding properties before being sold, as proof of their reproductive capacity. Moses and Daniel were brothers, purchased together in 1846. Margaret paid $1,800 for both. Again, a premium price that only made sense if she saw them not as workers, but as long-term reproductive investment. A letter from Margaret to her sister, found among personal correspondence, confirmed this. I have acquired 2 brothers of magnificent constitution. If they prove as fertile as promised, I will have doubled my investment in less than a decade. The mathematics was chilling. If each of the 6 men produced an average of 4 children who survived to working age, Margaret would have gained 24 new enslaved people without spending a cent on purchases. At market prices of the time, approximately $800 to $1,200 per young enslaved person, that represented between $19,000 and $28,000 in new property value. Margaret's initial investment in the 6 men was approximately $5,000. The return on investment was staggering, but the human cost was incalculable. Marcus found testimony from formerly enslaved people collected by the Works Progress Administration in the 1930s, decades after abolition. One man named Joseph Thornhill, likely a descendant of the plantation, described what his grandmother had told him about life under Lady Margaret. She picked the young ones, strong ones, put them with the women whether they wanted or not. Grandmother said the women cried at night, said the men looked dead in the eyes, like their souls was somewhere else. Another testimony from a woman named Sarah who had been enslaved at a neighboring plantation mentioned Thornhill specifically. We all knew what went on over at Thornhill Place. Lady Margaret, she ran it like a farm, but people was the crop. Girls who got big with child, she'd move them to special cabins. Men who fathered the most children, she'd keep them separate, treat them little better than the others, made them think they was special, but they was just studs to her. The 6 men in the photograph weren't chosen randomly. They were selected through a calculated process, purchased at premium prices, and deployed as instruments of a reproductive system designed to maximize Margaret's wealth. Their names, their histories, their humanity, all of it was secondary to their function. They were breeding stock, nothing more. Marcus found one more devastating detail in Margaret's correspondence. In a letter dated 1849, she wrote to a fellow plantation owner, I have found that separating the men from any emotional attachment to the women or children produces more consistent results. They must understand their purpose is not companionship, but increase. Sentiment is the enemy of efficiency. That single sentence revealed everything. Margaret didn't just orchestrate a breeding program. She engineered it with cold industrial precision, deliberately destroying any possibility of family bonds, love, or human connection. The men in the photograph weren't fathers. They weren't husbands. They weren't even allowed to be human. They were Margaret's reproductive machinery, and she maintained them with the same detachment she maintained her cotton gins. When Claire read these documents, she couldn't look at the photograph anymore. Those 6 faces standing behind Margaret and her sons now carried the weight of unspeakable suffering. They were ghosts, frozen in time, their names barely preserved, their stories almost completely erased. Almost. Because Marcus was determined to uncover every detail no matter how painful. The men deserved to be remembered not as breeding stock, but as human beings who endured unimaginable horror. The investigation was deepening. The men's identities were just the surface. Beneath lay an entire system of forced reproduction, and at its center was a woman who smiled for the camera while orchestrating one of slavery's darkest chapters. Chapter 3. The Women Who Disappeared from Records. While the 6 men in Margaret Thornhill's photograph were at least documented in ledgers and purchase receipts, the women who bore their children existed only as shadows in the historical record. Their names appeared in birth registries as mothers, but beyond that, they were virtually erased. No photographs, no purchase records with detailed descriptions, no letters mentioning them by name. It was as if Margaret Thornhill deliberately kept the women invisible, perhaps understanding that documenting her breeding program's female side too explicitly would leave evidence of her crimes. Dr. Marcus Webb spent months tracking down every possible reference to women at Thornhill Plantation between 1845 and 1865. The census records provided only numbers. In 1850, there were 18 enslaved women between ages 15 and 35 at the property. By 1860, that number had risen to 31. But unlike the men, whose premium purchases Margaret documented for business purposes, most of the women seemed to have been born on the property itself, or acquired through less formal channels. The birth records were where the pattern became undeniable. Between 1848 and 1865, 84 children were born at Thornhill Plantation. Of those, 73 survived past infancy, an unusually high survival rate that suggested Margaret invested in keeping newborns alive because they represented future property value. But the distribution of births was telling. The same 12 women accounted for 61 of those births. Each of these women had between 4 and 7 children during the 17-year period, a rate far higher than the plantation average and consistent with forced, systematic reproduction. Marcus found one ledger entry that made his blood run cold. In 1852, Margaret wrote, "Martha, age 19, has proven most productive with 5 healthy births in 6 years. Have moved her to the nursery cabin where she can focus entirely on childbearing without field labor distractions. This arrangement should yield at least 4 more before her productive years decline." Martha. At least now one woman had a name. But the clinical language, productive, yield, productive years decline, reduced a human being to a breeding animal with a calculable lifespan of usefulness. Marcus searched desperately for any other mention of Martha. He found one more, dated 1864. Martha, age 31, delivered stillborn child. Her 8th pregnancy. Productivity declining. Will reassign to field work. Now I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this story. I want to know how far these silenced accounts reach. After the war, when formerly enslaved people were interviewed, a few mentioned women from Thornhill Plantation, though never by name. One testimony from 1937 described the breeding cabins at a plantation that matched Thornhill's description. They had cabins set apart for the women who was having babies. Lady there, she kept them separate, gave them a little more food, didn't work them as hard when they was carrying. But soon as the baby was weaned, they'd take it away and put her with a man again. Some women had baby after baby, never got to keep none of them. The separation of mothers from children was deliberate strategy. If women bonded with their children, they might resist future forced pregnancies. If children knew their mothers, family units might form, creating loyalty structures that could threaten plantation control. By systematically separating infants from mothers after weaning, usually around 18 months, Margaret ensured that neither mothers nor children developed attachments that might interfere with her reproductive program. Claire Hartwell found this aspect of her ancestors' operation almost more disturbing than the forced breeding itself. She wasn't just forcing reproduction, Claire said in a later interview. She was deliberately destroying motherhood, preventing any maternal bond from forming. Every instinct, every natural human connection. She weaponized the absence of it. Marcus discovered references to a nursery system in Margaret's correspondence with other plantation owners. Children weaned from their mothers were placed in collective nursery cabins, supervised by 1 or 2 older enslaved women. This freed the mothers for immediate return to the breeding program, while minimizing the labor cost of childcare. The nursery supervisors cared for up to 20 children simultaneously, an impossible ratio that explained the high infant mortality rate archaeologists would later discover in the cemetery. One letter Margaret wrote in 1856 laid out her philosophy with chilling clarity. "I have observed that women who are permitted to raise their own children become emotionally volatile and resistant to necessary breeding discipline. By removing infants to communal care after weaning, one eliminates sentimental interference while maintaining the mother's productivity. The children, raised without knowledge of maternal bonds, prove more tractable as future labor. The women of Thornhill Plantation existed in a special category of horror. They were simultaneously victims of sexual violence and engines of Margaret's wealth accumulation. Unlike enslaved women on plantations where reproduction happened through individual assaults by overseers or owners, the women at Thornhill were subjected to an industrial system. They weren't individuals targeted by individual perpetrators. They were components of a machine, systematically paired with specific men, their cycles likely tracked, their pregnancies monitored like livestock. Marcus found evidence that Margaret kept detailed records of each woman's menstrual cycle and pregnancy status. A ledger page from 1858 listed women by name with notations. Sarah, breeding with Jacob, 3rd month. Rebecca, delivered, recovering, will resume next month. Hannah, 4th pregnancy, showing well. The clinical tracking suggested Margaret personally oversaw the entire operation, managing human reproduction with the same attention she gave to cotton planting schedules. One of the most devastating discoveries was a bill of sale from 1861. As the Civil War began and Margaret feared Union forces might reach South Carolina, she sold 7 women and their children to a plantation further south. The sale document listed Martha, age 28, and her property increase, 5 children ages 2 to 9. Proven breeder, excellent health, docile temperament. Price, $3,800. Martha, the woman whose productivity Margaret had tracked since 1852, was sold along with 5 of her children. But the document mentioned 8 pregnancies. Where were the other 3 children? Dead in infancy? Sold separately? The records gave no answer. Martha simply disappeared from Thornhill documents after that sale, her fate unknown, her voice unheard, her story reduced to a transaction receipt. The women of Thornhill Plantation were deliberately made invisible. While Margaret photographed herself with the 6 men, perhaps seeing the men as evidence of her shrewd investment, she never photographed the women. Perhaps she understood that images of the women, especially pregnant or with infants, would be too obviously evidence of what she was doing. Or perhaps, in her twisted logic, the men were the valuable reproducers while the women were simply vessels, unworthy of documentation. Marcus and Claire knew that recovering these women's stories would be nearly impossible. Unlike the men, whose premium purchases created paper trails, the women left almost no trace. They were ghosts in the historical record, their suffering unwitnessed, their resistance undocumented, their humanity denied even in death. But the investigators were determined to find whatever fragments remained, to piece together what could be known, and to ensure these women were remembered not as breeding stock, but as human beings who endured one of slavery's cruelest systems. The next step was the cemetery. If documents had failed the women, perhaps archaeology could speak for them. Chapter 4. The Letters Margaret Never Meant to Share. In August 2020, while Marcus Webb continued analyzing census data and Claire Hartwell grappled with her family's legacy, a breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A historical society in Charleston received a donation of documents from the estate of Rebecca Morrison, a distant relative of the Thornhill family. Among the donated materials was a leather portfolio containing 43 letters exchanged between Lady Margaret Thornhill and other plantation mistresses in South Carolina and Georgia between 1848 and 1862. The letters were never meant for public eyes. They were private correspondence between women of the planter class, discussing the intimate details of plantation management, personal grievances, and social matters. But threaded throughout the seemingly mundane discussions of garden parties and church socials was something far darker. Detailed exchanges about breeding programs, reproductive strategies, and the deliberate engineering of human reproduction for profit. When Marcus first read the letters, he had to set them down several times. The casual tone in which Margaret and her correspondents discussed forcing human reproduction was more disturbing than any clinical ledger entry. These weren't cold business records. They were women chatting like friends, sharing advice about breeding enslaved people the way they might share recipes or needlework patterns. One letter, dated March 1849, came from a woman named Elizabeth Sutherland, who owned a plantation in Georgia. She wrote, "My dear Margaret, I received your inquiry about increasing property through natural means rather than costly purchases. I have had excellent success with this method for nearly a decade. The key is selecting young, robust men and pairing them systematically with fertile women. I maintain 6 men specifically for this purpose, rotating them among 12 women of childbearing age. I find that keeping detailed monthly records and timing the pairings precisely yields the best results. Margaret's response, dated 2 months later, showed she had taken Elizabeth's advice to heart. Your guidance has proven invaluable, dear friend. I have acquired 6 exceptional specimens from Virginia and Georgia breeding farms. The investment was substantial, but I anticipate returns within 5 years. I have already observed encouraging signs among several of the women. I find that maintaining firm discipline and removing sentimentality from the process produces more consistent outcomes. The correspondence between Margaret and Elizabeth continued for years, growing increasingly detailed and disturbingly casual. In 1851, Elizabeth wrote, "I have found that the women resist less if one frames the arrangement as privilege rather than punishment. I tell them that bearing children spares them from the harshest field labor. This creates a perverse gratitude that makes management easier. Of course, once the child is weaned, they return to work regardless, but the initial cooperation is valuable." Margaret adopted this strategy. In an 1852 letter, she reported, "I have implemented your suggestion about framing breeding duty as privilege. The women's resistance has notably decreased. I also find that providing slightly better rations to pregnant women serves dual purpose: healthier offspring and incentive for cooperation. The additional food cost is negligible compared to property value gained." The letters revealed that Margaret and her correspondents formed an informal network, sharing strategies and advice about their breeding programs. They discussed which men produced the strongest children, which women were most productive, how to handle women who resisted, and methods for maximizing births while minimizing costs. They traded information like any other business network, except their business was human reproduction. One particularly chilling exchange occurred in 1854. A woman named Caroline Whitmore wrote to Margaret describing a difficulty. "One of my breeding women has become uncooperative. She refuses the assigned pairing and has proven quite obstinate despite correction. Do you have advice for managing such resistance?" Margaret's response was coldly pragmatic. "I have encountered similar obstinacy. I find that isolation proves effective. Remove the woman from others, limit her rations to basic sustenance, and make clear that cooperation restores both. I have never had a woman maintain resistance beyond a fortnight under these conditions. Alternatively, if she has already produced sufficient offspring, reassign her to field labor and replace her with a younger woman. Sometimes replacing the resistant is more efficient than correcting them." The letters also revealed how these women justified their actions to themselves. They used euphemisms, natural increase, property improvement, breeding program, that distanced them from the reality of what they were doing. They framed their breeding operations as shrewd business strategy, proof of their management skills, evidence of their worth as plantation mistresses. In their minds, they weren't orchestrating systematic rape and forced reproduction. They were being resourceful, practical, efficient. In an 1857 letter to Elizabeth, Margaret wrote with unmistakable pride, "My breeding program has exceeded expectations. In 9 years, I have increased my property by 47 individuals through natural means, representing approximately $35,000 in value with minimal investment beyond initial purchases. I attribute this success to systematic record-keeping, careful selection, and firm discipline. Other mistresses in the county have begun asking my advice." The letters confirmed what census records had suggested. Margaret Thornhill was not an aberration. She was part of a network of plantation mistresses who deliberately implemented forced breeding programs, sharing strategies and advice, competing over results and taking pride in their efficiency. The system wasn't the work of one woman but of an entire class of white women who saw enslaved people as livestock and managed them accordingly. Marcus found evidence that this network was larger than just correspondence. The letters mentioned gatherings where plantation mistresses would meet, ostensibly for tea and social purposes, but where they also discussed management strategies. In an 1859 letter, Margaret mentioned, "The ladies' gathering at the Whitmore estate was most enlightening. Several shared fascinating innovations in property increase. I have adopted Caroline's suggestion of maintaining separate nursing cabins to speed return to breeding after birth, already seeing improved results." These ladies' gatherings were slave breeding strategy sessions disguised as social events. While historians had long known that plantation mistresses sometimes managed slave systems, these letters revealed organized, deliberate collaboration, in orchestrating forced reproduction. It wasn't hidden violence by male overseers. It was systematic, openly discussed and managed by women who saw themselves as respectable, refined, Christian ladies. One letter from 1860 exposed the moral gymnastics these women performed to justify their actions. Elizabeth wrote to Margaret, "I have been questioned by some church ladies about the morality of breeding arrangements. I explained that we are simply managing our property responsibly, ensuring sufficient labor without costly purchases. We are not forcing anything unnatural. Reproduction is natural. We merely facilitate it efficiently." This satisfied most inquiries. Margaret's response showed she had faced similar questions. "I too have encountered such narrow-minded criticism. I respond that our system is more humane than the slave trade, as it keeps families on the same property rather than separating them through purchases. Of course, we do separate mothers from children, but at an age when such separation causes no lasting harm. This framing has proven effective in deflecting criticism." The self-deception was almost as disturbing as the violence itself. These women convinced themselves they were being humane, practical, even ethical. They reframed systematic forced reproduction as responsible property management. They called separation of mothers and children painless because the children were too young to remember. They transformed horror into business strategy and called it progress. The final letter in the collection was dated April 1862, as the Civil War intensified. Margaret wrote to Elizabeth, "The war brings uncertainty, but I have confidence our property will endure regardless of outcome. The children raised in our system know no other life and will continue to work should circumstances change. We have built something sustainable, something that will outlast current upheaval." Margaret was wrong. Slavery would end 3 years later, but in a sense she was also right. The trauma of her system would outlast the war by generations. The children raised in Thornhill's breeding cabins would carry that trauma their entire lives, passing it down to children who would pass it to their children. The destruction Margaret engineered would ripple forward through time, invisible but devastating. Marcus compiled the letters into evidence for what was becoming more than historical research. It was documentation of organized, systematic crimes against humanity, carried out by women who saw themselves as respectable society ladies. The letters were Margaret's own words, condemning her in a way no external analysis ever could. Claire could no longer defend her ancestor. The letters made denial impossible. Margaret Thornhill wasn't a product of her time, managing her plantation as any other mistress would. She was an architect of deliberate cruelty, collaborating with others to perfect systems of forced reproduction, taking pride in her efficiency, and feeling no remorse for the lives she destroyed. The photograph of 1847 took on even darker meaning. Those 6 young men standing behind Margaret weren't just property. They were instruments of a system she had carefully designed, corresponded about with friends, and refined over years. They were victims of a network of women who turned human reproduction into an industry. The investigation was moving toward its most difficult phase. Letters and ledgers provided documentary evidence, but the human cost remained abstract. To truly understand what happened at Thornhill Plantation, they would need to excavate the cemetery where the children of Margaret's breeding program were buried. The ground itself would have to testify. Chapter 5. The Cemetery That Remembered What Documents Forgot. In March 2022, Dr. Marcus Webb secured permission from the current landowners, a development company that had purchased the former Thornhill Plantation property in 2015, to conduct archaeological excavation of what local historians had identified as the enslaved people's cemetery. The site was a half-acre plot on a hillside, marked by weathered stones and almost completely obscured by kudzu and pine trees. No one had maintained it in over a century. Most locals didn't even know it existed. Marcus assembled a team of forensic archaeologists, bioarchaeologists, and historians. Ground-penetrating radar revealed what appeared to be over 140 burial sites in the small cemetery, far more than anyone expected. If the census records were correct, approximately 127 people had been enslaved at Thornhill Plantation at abolition in 1865, yet the cemetery contained 140-plus burials. The discrepancy suggested significant mortality, particularly among the most vulnerable, infants and children. The excavation began in April 2022. Within the first week, the team uncovered evidence that would transform the investigation from historical research into something approaching criminal investigation. The remains told stories that documents had deliberately obscured. The ground remembered what Margaret Thornhill had tried to erase. The first complete skeletal remains excavated belonged to an infant, no more than 6 months old at death. The tiny bones showed signs of severe malnutrition and possible disease. Over the following weeks, the team uncovered remains of 37 more infants and young children, all under age 5. Some showed signs of malnutrition, others showed evidence of untreated injuries. Several had bone malformations consistent with diseases caused by vitamin deficiencies and inadequate care. Dr. Sarah Chen, the lead bioarchaeologist, presented her findings to Marcus with visible distress. The infant mortality rate at this site is approximately 40%, meaning roughly 4 out of every 10 children born here died before age 5. Compare that to other plantation sites we've studied, where infant mortality averaged around 15 to 20%. This isn't normal variation, this is systematic neglect. The forensic evidence aligned with what Margaret's letters had suggested. Children were removed from their mothers after weaning and placed in collective nursery cabins with inadequate supervision. The high mortality rate was a predictable result of that system. Infants and young children need individual attention, consistent care, proper nutrition. The nursery system provided none of these. Children died from preventable illnesses, inadequate feeding, and lack of medical attention. But in Margaret's calculation, this was acceptable loss. Not every child needed to survive, only enough to maintain profitability. Marcus did the grim mathematics. If 84 children were born between 1848 and 1865, and the cemetery contained remains of 38 infants and children, that was a 45% mortality rate, even worse than the cemetery's overall statistics suggested. Margaret's breeding program wasn't just forcing reproduction, it was producing children under conditions that killed nearly half of them before they reached working age. The excavation uncovered something even more disturbing, evidence of differential burial practices. Infants and young children were buried in simple graves with no coffins, no markers, no artifacts. Their remains were found in shallow pits, sometimes 2 or 3 bodies layered in the same grave space. But adult remains showed more care, deeper graves, evidence of wooden coffins, occasional personal items buried with the body. Dr. Chen explained the implication. When children died, they were buried quickly and cheaply, with minimal effort. The adult burials show more respect, more care. This suggests the children were seen as less valuable, more expendable. Their deaths were expected, routine, not worth the investment of proper burial. Claire Hartwell, who visited the excavation site in May 2022, broke down when shown the infant remains. She bred them like livestock, and when they died, she buried them like waste, Claire said through tears. These were children, babies, and she calculated their deaths into her profit margins. The skeletal remains revealed one more crucial detail, evidence of family relationships. DNA analysis on select remains showed that several of the children buried in the cemetery shared paternal lineage. Multiple children, born to different mothers, had the same father. When Dr. Chen cross-referenced this genetic data with the men identified in the 1847 photograph, a pattern emerged. 3 of the 6 men, Samuel, Jacob, and Moses, appeared to be biological fathers of at least 23 of the children buried in the cemetery. The genetic evidence confirmed what documents had suggested. Margaret's breeding program systematically paired specific men with multiple women, producing children with shared paternity. The men weren't just workers. They were literal breeding stock, their genetic legacy scattered across dozens of children they likely never knew. Marcus found this genetic evidence particularly devastating. These men were forced to father children they couldn't raise, couldn't protect, couldn't even acknowledge. Many of those children died in infancy or early childhood. The men would have known children were being born, would have seen infants around the plantation, but Margaret's system prevented them from knowing which were theirs. The psychological torture of that, it's almost beyond comprehension. The excavation also revealed evidence of violence. Several adult remains showed signs of trauma, broken bones that had healed, evidence of blunt force injuries, wear patterns on bones consistent with heavy physical labor from young ages. One set of remains, a man estimated to be in his early 30s at death, showed evidence of a broken jaw that had healed incorrectly, fractures to ribs and unusual wear on wrist and ankle bones suggesting long-term shackling. Dr. Chen theorized this might be remains of one of the men from the breeding program, possibly someone who had resisted or tried to escape. The injuries suggested sustained physical punishment and restraint. The man had survived to adulthood, but had endured brutal violence throughout his life. His body was a map of suffering, each bone telling part of a story of torture and endurance. The cemetery excavation transformed the investigation. Documents had provided numbers, dates, economic calculations. The letters had revealed Margaret's mindset and methods, but the bones brought the human cost into stark reality. Each tiny skeleton represented a life that barely began before ending. Each adult remain represented decades of suffering and forced labor. The cemetery was testimony that documents couldn't provide. Marcus arranged for the remains to be analyzed, documented, and eventually reburied with proper ceremony and markers bearing their names where known, or simply acknowledgement where names had been lost. A memorial service was held in October 2022, attended by descendants of enslaved people from Thornhill Plantation, historians, and local community members. Claire Hartwell spoke at the service, apologizing on behalf of her family and committing to ensuring Margaret Thornhill's crimes were remembered, not hidden. But the investigation still had one major unanswered question. What happened after abolition? Where did the survivors go? What became of the children raised in Margaret's system and the men and women who endured it? Documents from Reconstruction era might provide answers, but Marcus knew that period was notoriously poorly documented for formerly enslaved people. Finding what happened after 1865 would require tracing fragments through hostile archives and deliberate erasure. The story of Thornhill Plantation didn't end with abolition. The trauma continued rippling forward through generations, and somewhere in archives, courthouses, and family memories, pieces of that continuing story waited to be found. Chapter 6. What happened when freedom came? If this story has gripped you so far, leave a like. It helps. Margaret Thornhill's victim's story reached more people. The Emancipation Proclamation of 1863 didn't immediately free enslaved people in South Carolina. The state remained under Confederate control until February 1865, when Union forces finally occupied Charleston. For the 127 enslaved people at Thornhill Plantation, freedom came not as a single moment of liberation, but as a gradual, uncertain transition filled with danger and confusion. Dr. Marcus Webb discovered that tracking formerly enslaved people after abolition was extraordinarily difficult. Many took new names, moved frequently, and appeared in official records only sporadically. But Reconstruction-era documents, Freedmen's Bureau records, church registries, land deed records, and later census data provided fragments of what happened to Thornhill's survivors. Margaret Thornhill fled the plantation in February 1865, just before Union forces reached the area. She took her 3 sons, packed valuable possessions into 2 wagons, and retreated to Charleston, where she moved into a townhouse owned by her sister. She never returned to the plantation. According to family letters discovered by Claire Hartwell, Margaret spent her final years bitter and impoverished, complaining that abolition had destroyed civilization and left her destitute. She died in 1879 at age 67, attended only by one of her sons. Her obituary in the Charleston newspaper described her as a lady of refined character and Christian virtue who endured great hardship during the recent unpleasantness. The contrast between Margaret's mythologized death and the reality her victims faced was stark. When Union soldiers reached Thornhill Plantation in March 1865, they found 109 formerly enslaved people still living on the property, 18 fewer than the 127 recorded in 1860 census. Where the missing 18 went remains unknown. Some likely died in the chaotic final years of the war. Others may have escaped earlier or been sold to plantations farther south as Union forces advanced. Freedmen's Bureau records from 1865-1868 documented some of Thornhill's survivors. The records listed names, ages, and occasionally family relationships. Marcus found entries for several people whose ages matched children who would have been born during Margaret's breeding program. One entry particularly stood out. Samuel Thornhill, age 39, formerly enslaved, claims no knowledge of parents, seeking work as laborer. Samuel Thornhill. The name matched Samuel, one of the 6 men from the 1847 photograph. If this was the same person, he had survived Margaret's system and taken Thornhill as his surname, a common practice among formerly enslaved people who adopted their former owner's name, not out of affection but because it was the only family name they knew. The Freedmen's Bureau record noted Samuel claims no knowledge of parents, which aligned with how breeding programs deliberately separated children from families. Marcus found 13 other people in Freedmen's Bureau records who had taken the surname Thornhill and listed South Carolina origins. All were between ages 15 and 35 in 1865, meaning they were born during or shortly before Margaret's breeding program. Their stories, pieced together from scattered records, revealed the long-term trauma of the system. One woman, listed as Martha Thornhill, age 33, 7 children, appeared in multiple Freedmen's Bureau records between 1865 and 1870. The age and number of children matched Martha, the woman Margaret had described in her ledgers as most productive. If this was the same Martha, she had survived the breeding program, born at least 7 children, and after freedom, struggled to keep her family together. Bureau records noted she applied for emergency rations in 1866 to feed children, and again in 1868, due to crop failure and inability to work while caring for young ones. The records revealed that freedom didn't mean escape from the breeding program's consequences. Women like Martha were left with multiple children to raise alone, no resources, no education, no property. The children fathered by men like Samuel grew up not knowing their fathers, scattered across the former plantation or surrounding areas, their family bonds deliberately destroyed by Margaret's system and never restored. Marcus found testimony from a Freedmen's Bureau agent named Robert Milhouse, who visited Thornhill Plantation in June 1865. Milhouse wrote, "The formerly enslaved people at this property present a peculiar situation. Many of the women have multiple young children, but claim no knowledge of the children's fathers. The women seem reluctant to discuss circumstances of the children's conception. Several men, when asked about family, became visibly distressed and refused to speak. The atmosphere here is one of deep trauma that I have not encountered at other properties." That observation aligned with what Marcus and Dr. Chen had theorized. The psychological damage of forced breeding was profound and lasting. Even after freedom, the victims couldn't or wouldn't discuss what had been done to them. The shame, trauma, and horror of systematic forced reproduction created silences that persisted for generations. By 1870, Census records showed most of Thornhill's former enslaved people had left the property. Some moved to Charleston or other cities, seeking work and anonymity. Others settled on small plots of land in rural areas, often in communities of other formerly enslaved people, where they could rebuild lives away from former owners. But their movements were constrained by sharecropping arrangements, black codes, and emerging Jim Crow laws that made true freedom elusive. Marcus found one extraordinary document, a letter written in 1872 by a formerly enslaved man named Jacob Washington to the Freedmen's Bureau, seeking information about his children. The letter, written in careful but imperfect handwriting, read, "Sirs, I was slave at Thornhill Place in South Carolina. The lady there forced breeding on me and other men. I do not know how many children I have or where they are. After freedom I left that place, could not bear to stay, but I think of those children. They are mine by blood even though I was not allowed to be father to them. If you have records of children born at Thornhill between 1848 and 1865, I would be grateful for any information. I am trying to find them. Jacob Washington." The letter broke Marcus's heart. This might be Jacob from the photograph, now using the surname Washington, trying decades after abolition to find children he had been forced to father, but never allowed to know. The Freedmen's Bureau's response, if any, wasn't in the archive. Jacob probably never found his children. Most likely they never knew he existed. Marcus traced Jacob Washington through later records. He appeared in the 1880 census, living in a freedmen community in Georgia, working as a carpenter, married to a woman named Sarah with no children listed. Whether he couldn't have more children or chose not to, or simply that his children with Sarah hadn't survived, the record didn't say. But there was something deeply tragic about Jacob spending his life searching for children taken from him, while apparently having no children in freedom. The Reconstruction era was when the full human cost of Margaret's program became clear. The breeding program didn't just harm people during slavery, it destroyed families permanently. Children grew up not knowing parents. Parents lived with the ghost knowledge that they had children somewhere but no way to find them. Siblings were scattered, unaware of each other's existence. The genetic and social fragmentation Margaret deliberately engineered couldn't be undone by emancipation. Marcus found one more crucial set of documents, testimony collected by a researcher in the 1930s as part of the Federal Writers Project, which interviewed elderly formerly enslaved people. One interview, conducted in 1937 with a man named Thomas Thornhill, then 92 years old, provided rare first-hand testimony about Thornhill Plantation. Thomas described life under Margaret. She was a hard woman, cold like winter. She treated us like animals she was raising, not people. The men she picked for breeding, she kept them separate, gave them a little more food, but they had it worse in other ways. They had to do things a man shouldn't be forced to do. After freedom, most of them left fast. Couldn't stay where that happened. I stayed because I was too old to travel far, but those young men, they disappeared into other places, tried to become new people. Thomas's testimony confirmed what documents suggested. The men subjected to forced breeding fled when possible, trying to escape the trauma by physically leaving and recreating their identities elsewhere. This helped explain why tracing them through records was so difficult. They deliberately severed connection to Thornhill and everything it represented. The story of what happened after freedom was ultimately one of fragmentation and loss. The survivors scattered, carrying trauma they couldn't discuss, searching for family they'd never known, trying to build lives from wreckage. Some succeeded in creating new families, new communities, new identities. Others lived haunted by what had been done to them, unable to escape Margaret's shadow even after her death. Claire Hartwell, researching her family's history, discovered she had distant cousins, descendants of Margaret's sons, who had no idea about their ancestors' crimes until Claire contacted them. The revelation shattered family myths across multiple branches of the Thornhill family tree. Several relatives refused to believe it. Others, like Claire, faced the truth and committed to remembering victims rather than perpetuating comfortable lies. But for every white Thornhill descendant grappling with uncomfortable history, there were dozens of black Thornhill descendants, people bearing the surname because their ancestors were enslaved there, who had always known something terrible happened, even if details were lost. For them, Claire's investigation wasn't revelation. It was confirmation of trauma passed down through generations in silence and fragments. The investigation had uncovered documents, excavated remains, traced survivors, and pieced together Margaret's system. But one question remained. Was Margaret Thornhill unique, or was she part of something larger? Were forced breeding programs isolated incidents, or were they systematic features of American slavery that history had deliberately obscured? To answer that, Marcus would need to look beyond Thornhill Plantation and examine whether other plantations operated similar systems, and if so, how widespread they were. Chapter 7. The Network of Silence. As Dr. Marcus Webb's investigation deepened, a disturbing pattern emerged. Margaret Thornhill wasn't an aberration. She was part of an extensive, deliberately hidden network of plantation mistresses across the South who operated forced breeding programs. The evidence was scattered across archives, carefully obscured in euphemistic language and almost never discussed in official histories. But once Marcus knew what to look for, the signs were everywhere. The letters Margaret exchanged with other plantation mistresses, Elizabeth Sutherland in Georgia, Caroline Whitmore in Virginia, and at least 6 others whose correspondence survived, revealed that forced breeding wasn't an isolated practice. It was discussed, refined, and spread through networks of white women who saw it as shrewd property management. They shared strategies at social gatherings, recommended breeding stock vendors to each other, and took pride in their efficiency. Marcus began investigating the plantations mentioned in Margaret's correspondence. Elizabeth Sutherland's property in Georgia, researched through county records and archaeological surveys, showed demographic patterns nearly identical to Thornhill's. Dramatic population increase through birth rather than purchase, systematically absent paternity records, and a cemetery with unusually high infant mortality. Census data showed Sutherland Plantation grew from 38 enslaved people in 1840 to 97 in 1860, suggesting a breeding program even more extensive than Margaret's. Caroline Whitmore's Virginia plantation revealed similar patterns. Records indicated she purchased young men from breeding farms at premium prices, maintained detailed ledgers of women's reproductive cycles, and corresponded extensively with other mistresses about property increase methods. When archaeologists examined the Whitmore Plantation Cemetery in 2023, they found remains of 52 infants and young children, another devastatingly high mortality rate consistent with neglectful nursery systems. Marcus discovered that the network extended beyond Margaret's immediate correspondence. Estate records from at least 23 plantations across South Carolina, Georgia, Virginia, North Carolina, and Alabama showed similar patterns. Demographic explosions through birth, absent paternity records, premium purchases of young men from specific breeding farms, and unusually high infant mortality. Not all plantation mistresses documented their operations as explicitly as Margaret did, but the demographic and economic patterns were unmistakable signatures of forced breeding programs. The breeding farms themselves, plantations that specialized in producing enslaved people for sale, were documented in academic histories but usually discussed obliquely, without examining the mechanics of how they operated. Marcus found advertisements in 1840s and 1850s newspapers from Virginia and Maryland offering prime breeding stock, both male and female, guaranteed healthy and proven fertile. These weren't euphemisms. They were literal advertisements for human beings selected and sold specifically for reproductive capacity. One advertisement from an 1851 Richmond newspaper read, "For sale, Negro man, age 21, extraordinary constitution, father of 7 documented offspring, price $1,100, guaranteed satisfaction or return within 1 year." The language was identical to livestock sales, and the guarantee period allowed buyers to verify the man would produce children before full payment. It was an industry with quality control standards. Marcus found bills of sale showing Margaret purchased at least 4 of her 6 men from a specific breeding farm in Virginia called Meadow Creek. When he investigated Meadow Creek, he discovered it was owned by a man named Richard Parsons, who operated what he explicitly advertised as a Negro breeding establishment. Parsons kept meticulous records of genetic lineages, tracked reproductive success rates, and sold enslaved people with pedigree documents like thoroughbred horses.